You really think he's going to be a problem? My son-in-law said to my daughter, loud enough for me to hear from the hallway. He didn't know I was standing there. He didn't know a lot of things about me. That was in October. By Thanksgiving, I understood exactly what kind of man my daughter had married. I'm 64 years old. I spent 31 years as a forensic accountant for the federal government, the kind of job where you learn to read numbers the way other people read faces. You learn patience. You learn that people who are hiding something almost always telegraph it, if you know where to look. I retired 3 years ago, moved to a smaller place in Flagstaff after my wife Lorraine passed, and I genuinely thought, that the hardest part of my life was behind me. I was wrong about that. My daughter Cassie is 36. She married a man named Derek 2 years before I retired. I won't pretend I loved him from the start. He had the kind of handshake that's too firm, the kind of eye contact that's slightly too steady. Like he'd read somewhere that confident men hold your gaze, and he was making sure to do exactly that. But Cassie loved him, and Cassie is smart, and I trusted her judgment. I kept my reservations to myself. They lived in Phoenix, about 2 hours from me. Close enough to visit, far enough that we weren't in each other's pockets. That suited everyone fine. Derek ran some kind of marketing consultancy. The details changed slightly every time he explained it, which I noticed but didn't comment on. Cassie was a pediatric nurse. She worked hard. She was good at what she did. The trouble started, as it often does, with money. About 8 months ago, Cassie called me on a Wednesday evening. She said she and Derek were thinking about buying a larger house. They were expecting, she told me, her voice careful and bright at the same time. I was going to be a grandfather. I sat down in my kitchen and felt something loosen in my chest that I hadn't known was tight. Then she told me the rest of it. They'd found a house they loved, but they were short on the down payment. Derek's business had been slow. Could I contribute something toward it? As a gift, not a loan. She was quick to say that. As a gift. I said yes. Of course I said yes. It was my daughter. It was going to be my grandchild. I transferred $60,000 from my savings into their joint account 2 weeks later. I had the paperwork, the wire confirmation, all of it documented, old habits from 30 years of following money trails. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. 3 months later, Derek called me himself. Not Cassie. Derek. He said he wanted to have lunch, just the two of us, that there was something he wanted to discuss. We met at a steakhouse in Scottsdale. His choice, the kind of place where everything costs too much, and the lighting is designed to make you feel like you're being evaluated. He told me over the first drink that he wanted me to think about restructuring my estate. He used those exact words, restructuring my estate. He said it the way you'd say, reorganizing the linen closet, like it was a perfectly ordinary, practical thing to bring up over lunch. He had a plan. He'd apparently spoken to an estate attorney, not mine, his own, and he felt that the best thing for everyone, for Cassie, for the baby, for me, would be if I established a living trust with Cassie as sole beneficiary and Derek as co-trustee. He explained the tax advantages. He had a folder. He brought a folder to lunch with printed documents and highlighted passages, and he slid it across the table to me with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. I looked at the folder. I looked at him. I said I'd think about it. I drove home to Flagstaff that afternoon, and I sat in my living room for a long time. My wife used to say I had 2 speeds, acting and waiting. She meant it as a criticism mostly, but she wasn't entirely wrong. I decided to wait, and while I waited, I started paying attention. What I noticed over the next 6 weeks was a pattern. Derek started calling more often. Never Cassie, always Derek. He had reasons to be in Flagstaff periodically, he said. He'd stop by, have coffee, make himself comfortable in my house. He was charming in those visits. Attentive. He'd ask about my health, about whether the altitude bothered me, whether I was sleeping well. At the time, I thought he was trying to build a relationship. Later, I understood he was doing an inventory. He asked once, very casually, about my medical history. Heart disease in the family? He'd heard that high altitude could be hard on people with certain conditions. Did I have a cardiologist I saw regularly? I told him I was in excellent health. That was true. But I watched his face when I said it, and I saw something flicker there. Not disappointment exactly, but recalculation. Around the same time, I noticed changes in how Cassie spoke to me. Small things. She started mentioning, gently, that she worried about me living alone, that Flagstaff winters were hard, that maybe I should think about somewhere more manageable. She mentioned a continuing care community in Scottsdale twice in 1 month. She'd never raised anything like that before. She and I had always been close, direct with each other. This felt scripted. I didn't confront her. I kept paying attention. The thing about spending 3 decades tracking financial fraud is that you develop an instinct for it that you can't fully turn off. Fraud almost never announces itself. It builds slowly in layers, each layer plausible on its own, and by the time the picture is complete, the damage is usually done. I had seen it 100 times in my career. The patient manipulation, the incremental isolation, the careful management of a target's perception of reality. I was being targeted. I was nearly certain of it. But nearly certain isn't evidence, and I needed evidence. I did 3 things. First, I called my own attorney, a woman named Patricia I'd worked with for years, and I updated my will and my healthcare directive. I made it unambiguous that Derek had no role in any decision regarding my health or my estate. Patricia asked if everything was all right. I told her I was being cautious. She said that was wise. Second, I quietly transferred a significant portion of my liquid assets into accounts Derek didn't know existed. My retirement accounts, my investment accounts. I restructured what I could, legally and cleanly, so that the picture of my finances that Derek had assembled over his visits was no longer accurate. Third, I started keeping a log. Every call from Derek, every visit, every comment about my health, my living situation, my estate, I wrote it down, date, time, what was said, exact words where I could remember them. I'm a meticulous note-taker. Another old habit. In February, Derek called to tell me he'd found a great deal on a ranch property outside of Wickenburg, about an hour northwest of Phoenix, very remote, beautiful land. He thought it might be a good investment, something we could look at together, a project to keep me engaged in retirement. He said he was driving out there the following Saturday to walk the property with the listing agent, and would I want to come along? I said yes. I want to be honest, I almost didn't go. I thought about it carefully. A remote property, just the 2 of us. I told Patricia where I was going and sent her the address. I told my neighbor Frank the same thing. I put my phone on full charge and brought a portable battery pack. And before I left, I wrote in my log, February 15th. Going to look at property in Wickenburg with Derek. If something happens to me, start here. It sounds dramatic when I write it like that, but I want you to understand. I didn't think he was going to murder me in a field. I thought something smaller. I thought he might want a witness to a conversation, or to establish that I'd agreed to something I hadn't agreed to, or simply to get me to sign something in a context where I was off guard and isolated. That was the kind of man I believed I was dealing with. I was wrong. He was worse than that. The property was a 40-acre parcel in rough high desert. It was February and cold, the kind of cold that gets into your joints. The listing agent wasn't there when we arrived. Derek said she was running late. She'd called him she'd be there in 20 minutes. We walked the perimeter of the property ourselves. About 15 minutes in, Derek stopped at the edge of a dry wash, a 6-foot drop into a rocky creek bed, bone dry in winter. He stood at the edge and looked out and started talking about his vision for the property. He was gesturing, animated. He said, "Come look at this view," and he moved to the right, along the edge, and I understood in that moment, not with my mind exactly, but with something older than my mind, that I should not move closer to that edge. I stepped back instead of forward. He turned and looked at me. Just for a second, something crossed his face that I had never seen there before. Not the salesman's mask, not the attentive son-in-law, something cold and calculating and very briefly unguarded. Then he smiled and said the wind was something out here, wasn't it? And turned back to the view. We walked back to the cars. The listing agent arrived a few minutes later. Nothing else happened. But I drove home to Flagstaff with my hands steady on the wheel and my mind running at a speed it hadn't run at in years. I called Frank when I got home. I updated my log with the time, the location, the dry wash, the step back, the look on Derek's face. I knew it wasn't evidence of anything specific, but I knew what I had seen. I also knew I was running out of time to get ahead of this. Here is what I knew about Derek by that point. Based on everything I had documented, he was patient, he was methodical. He had been working this for months. He believed I was a lonely old man whose daughter was already half convinced he needed to be managed. He had, through Cassie, established himself in a position where if something happened to me, he would be the one making decisions. Unless I had done what I'd done with Patricia, which he didn't know about. What I needed was for him not to know what I knew, and for everything he believed about me to remain intact, until I was ready. I called a friend from my federal days, a man who had spent 20 years in financial crimes investigation before retiring to Tucson. I told him what I had. I asked him how to build a case out of circumstantial evidence and pattern behavior. He said, "Get him to say it. Not out loud to you," he clarified. "Get him to put it in writing. People like this," he said, "they get confident. They start to feel untouchable, and when they feel untouchable, they get sloppy with communications." He asked me, "Does Derek use email, text? Is there any ongoing financial conversation between you two in writing?" There was. Derek had, over the preceding months, sent me several emails, framed as helpful, informational, about estate planning, about trusts, about the tax implications of various structures, all of it carefully worded, nothing explicitly incriminating. But there was a paper trail. I started responding to those emails. Slowly, carefully, I let Derek believe that I was warming up to his ideas. I asked questions that invited him to elaborate. I expressed hesitation in ways that invited reassurance. I said things like, "I've been thinking about what you said at lunch, and I wonder if you're right that I should simplify things." I let him lead. And he did. Over 6 weeks of email correspondence, Derek outlined in his own words, in writing, a complete picture of what he intended, not all at once, in pieces. The trust structure he wanted, the healthcare proxy he thought made sense, the financial consolidation he believed was in my best interest. He even mentioned once that certain assets would be better positioned if they were transferred before any health event created complications. Health event. That was the phrase he used. Health event. I printed every email. I sent copies to Patricia. I sent copies to my federal friend in Tucson, and then I called a detective at the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office that my friend knew, a woman who specialized in elder financial abuse cases. I brought her everything I had: the log, the emails, the documentation of the $60,000 transfer, the account of the Wickenburg property visit, and the dry wash. She listened to all of it. Then she said, "This is a very thorough file." I told her I used to follow money for a living. She said it showed. She said the emails were significant, particularly the phrase "health event" in the context of asset transfer, combined with the documented pattern of behavior. She said it wasn't enough to arrest anyone today, but it was enough to open an investigation. She would need to talk to Cassie. That was the part I had been dreading. I asked if I could talk to Cassie first. She said I had 48 hours. I drove to Phoenix on a Tuesday morning. I called Cassie and told her I wanted to take her to lunch, just the two of us, that there was something I needed to discuss. She sounded uncertain on the phone. She asked if everything was okay. I said I just wanted to see her. We met at a quiet restaurant near the hospital where she worked. She was 7 months pregnant, tired around the eyes, but still my daughter. That particular way she has of tilting her head when she's listening, exactly the way her mother used to. I had to pause for a moment when I sat down across from her. I thought about Lorraine. I thought about how much I wished she were here for this, and how much I was glad she wasn't. I laid it out for Cassie the way I used to lay out a case. Methodically. I showed her the log. I showed her the emails. I described the visit to Wickenburg, the dry wash, the step back, the look on his face. I watched her face change as I talked. Cassie is not a naive person. She is a nurse. She is trained to observe, to assess, to not let her feelings override her judgment. But she loved Derek. She had built a life with him. She was 7 months pregnant with his child. So what I watched happen in her face over the course of that lunch was not simply shock. It was something more complicated and more painful than that. It was a whole architecture coming apart, piece by piece. While she tried to keep her expression steady, she didn't cry in the restaurant. She asked me 3 or 4 questions, sharp, precise questions, the kind her mother would have asked. She wanted to know exactly what the detective had said. She wanted to know what opening an investigation meant in practical terms. She wanted to know about the $60,000. I told her the $60,000 was gone and I didn't care about it. She looked at me for a long time. Then she said, "Dad, I'm so sorry." I told her she had nothing to be sorry for. She said I knew something was wrong. I didn't know what it was. I felt like I was losing my grip on something, and I didn't know how to name it. I reached across the table and held her hand. Outside the restaurant window, it was a bright Phoenix afternoon, the kind of hard winter light that makes everything look overexposed. I thought about what a long way we had come to sit here, the two of us, in this specific kind of grief. The investigation moved quickly once it opened. Cassie cooperated fully. She gave the detective access to their joint financial records, and what investigators found in those records was worse than what I had assembled on my own. Derek had, over the preceding year, siphoned approximately $90,000 from their joint accounts into accounts Cassie didn't know existed. He had opened 2 credit cards in her name without her knowledge. There was a life insurance policy on me, taken out through a broker Derek had used, with Cassie listed as beneficiary and Derek as the managing party, that I had never been informed about, using a document I had apparently signed at some point during one of his visits, amid a stack of other papers he'd asked me to initial. That one took my breath away. That one I had missed. Elder financial abuse in Arizona carries serious penalties. combined with the fraudulent credit accounts and the forged signature on the insurance documents, Derek was looking at multiple felony charges. He was arrested on a Thursday morning in March at the house he and Cassie shared while Cassie was at work. He did not go quietly. His attorney tried several angles, including the argument that everything had been done with my knowledge and consent, and that the emails simply reflected conversations we'd had together. That's when my documentation, every email, every date, every log entry, became the spine of the prosecution's case. When you can show a jury the exact progression of manipulation in writing, time-stamped, it's difficult to argue consent. He pled guilty in June to 3 of the charges. He is currently serving time. The divorce was finalized before my granddaughter was born. My granddaughter's name is June. She was born in early September, 7 pounds 4 ounces, with her mother's eyes and, according to everyone who has met her, my stubbornness. I drove down to Phoenix for the birth, and I held her about 20 minutes after she came into the world. And I stood there in that hospital room thinking about all the things that had to happen, all the steps that had to be taken, all the patience and the anger and the grief and the careful, meticulous documentation, so that I would be standing here, in this room, holding this particular child. Cassie is doing well. She sold the house and bought a smaller one closer to the hospital. She's in therapy, which she says is hard and necessary. We talk every Sunday. She has good people around her. Last Thanksgiving, the first real one we'd had in years, just the two of us, and June and Cassie's friend Paulette, who made a sweet potato dish that Lorraine would have admired. My daughter raised her glass before dinner. She looked at me across the table and said, "I'm glad you were paying attention." I said, "That's what fathers do." She said, "No. That's what you do." She wasn't wrong about that either. I want to say one more thing, because I've thought about it a lot in the months since all of this ended. People ask me, when I've told parts of this story to old colleagues, to friends, they ask how I knew something was wrong before I had proof. And the honest answer is I didn't know. I suspected. I observed. I documented, I moved carefully, and I didn't let anyone, not Derek, not even Cassie, see that I was moving at all. That's not intuition. That's 31 years of training that I didn't leave in a filing cabinet when I retired. The other thing people ask is, weren't you scared? And the answer to that is, yes. Not at the dry wash in Wickenburg, not exactly. But sitting alone in my living room in Flagstaff on a February night, knowing what I suspected, knowing I was alone, knowing that the person I was up against had been patient and thorough, and was working through someone I loved. Yes, I was scared, but here's what I know about fear. After 64 years, it tells you something is real. It sharpens you. And if you're the kind of person who has spent a career learning to be slow and careful and absolutely certain, fear doesn't paralyze you. It just tells you it's time to get to work. I've been thinking about the folder a lot lately. The one Derek brought to that steakhouse lunch, printed, tabbed, highlighted like he'd spent a weekend putting it together, like he was presenting a business proposal. In a way, I suppose he was. What I keep coming back to is not the audacity of it, though that was something. It's the assumption underneath it. The assumption that I would see that folder and feel flattered or reassured or simply too old and too tired to read what was actually in it, that I would nod and say, yes, that sounds sensible, and sign where he pointed. He had built an entire plan around a version of me that didn't exist. That's the thing about people who operate the way Derek operated. They are, in their own way, meticulous. They do their research. They identify what they think are the weaknesses. The loneliness, the age, the grief, the desire to believe that the people around you have good intentions. And they build on those assumptions layer by careful layer over months. It takes real patience, real discipline. In another life, Derek might have been good at something honest. But here is what that kind of intelligence misses every time. It only accounts for what it can see. Derek saw a 64-year-old widower living alone in Flagstaff. He saw a man who had lost his wife, who loved his daughter, who might be grateful for attention and guidance from a younger man who seemed to have things figured out. He built his plan around that picture. What he didn't see, what he had no way of accounting for because I gave him no reason to, was the 31 years I had spent doing exactly what he was trying to do to me, but in reverse, following money, identifying patterns, building cases out of small, individually meaningless details until the picture was impossible to look away from. He brought a folder. I kept a log. And that, I think, is the thing worth sitting with. Not as a story about me specifically, but as a truth about how consequences actually work. Actions accumulate. Every email Derek sent, every visit, every casual question about my health, every carefully worded suggestion. Each one felt small and deniable in the moment. Together they built the case that put him where he is now. He constructed his own outcome, one reasonable seeming step at a time, and never understood that someone was writing it all down. Cassie asked me once, after everything was over, whether I ever doubted myself, whether I ever thought maybe I was reading too much into things, being paranoid, letting grief make me suspicious of people who didn't deserve it. I told her, yes. Constantly. That's why I wrote everything down, because I didn't trust my instincts alone. I trusted my documentation. That distinction matters more than it might seem. Instinct tells you something is wrong. Discipline makes you useful when something is wrong. The two things together, the gut feeling and the methodical, patient, unglamorous work of building something solid out of it. That's what actually changes outcomes. That's what kept me standing in a hospital room 9 months later, holding June. I don't think I'm remarkable. I think I got lucky in a specific way. The skills I happened to spend my career building turned out to be exactly the skills this situation required. Not everyone gets that. But I do think there's something transferable in it, something that has nothing to do with forensic accounting. It's simply this. When something feels wrong, don't just feel it. Do something with it. Write it down. Talk to someone you trust. Move carefully and don't show your hand before you're ready. Fear is information. Patience is a tool, and the people who count on you being too tired or too sad or too old to pay attention, they are almost always wrong. I know I was scared in that living room in February. I also know that fear did not win. June is 7 months old now. She has her mother's eyes. She has, allegedly, my stubbornness. I drove down to Phoenix last weekend and held her in the afternoon light coming through Cassie's kitchen window, and I thought, this is what the work was for. Not the justice, not the outcome. Not even the satisfaction of being right. This, right here, this is what you protect when you refuse to give up.